My father, Jack, stood in front of the fire, his hands trembling ever so slightly, a rare sign of the storm raging inside him. I, his son, had watched him face down every challenge life had thrown at him without flinching. Until now. The HOA had just cut the power to his 750K cabin, and little did they know, they'd just provoked the wrong man. Jack wasn't just some grizzled recluse living off the grid. He was the one holding this entire region's power supply together, and the HOA had just stepped into a fight they couldn't win. The wind screamed through the valley, bending the towering pines as if they were mere twigs. Snow whipped across the landscape in blinding sheets, creating a world of stark white where everything seemed muffled and distant. It was the kind of storm that would drive anyone indoors, huddled by a fire, safe and warm. But not my father. He'd built his cabin up here for moments just like this, away from the noise of the world, away from the responsibilities that followed him everywhere. Else, the cabin, nestled deep within the forest, had been his refuge for years, a place where he could disconnect, breathe deeply, and let the burdens of life slip away. It was the one place he could count on to be just as he'd left it, serene and unchanging. But that morning the silence felt wrong. The familiar hum of the electricity that powered the cabin's lights, fridge, and heater was absent. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe a storm-induced outage, I thought. But when I tried calling my father and got no answer, my concern began to grow. I tried again, and then again, the ringing tone filling the air with a quiet urgency. Something wasn't right. I was in the middle of grabbing my coat when the phone rang. It was my dad, and his voice, when it came through, was tight with frustration and confusion. "Son," he said, his voice carrying a tension that immediately set my nerves on edge. "The power's gone out, and this time, I think they've cut it." I frowned, pacing the kitchen. "Cut it? What do you mean? You're not on the grid. Your solar and wind systems are self-sufficient, right?" "Yeah," he replied. But there was an edge to his voice now, one that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. "They've cut it, and I don't think it's just a storm issue. I think they're targeting me." A cold chill crept down my spine. The power, in a region like this, wasn't something to be taken lightly. Dad had always been proud of the fact that he lived off the grid. His setup wasn't just practical, it was a point of pride. He'd designed and maintained it himself, and it had served him well, even through the harshest of winters. But if someone had figured out how to disrupt it— "I'm heading up there," I told him quickly, already grabbing my keys. "Stay put. I'll be there in a few hours." The drive up to the cabin was treacherous. The snowstorm raged outside, the wind making the roads even more dangerous. But it was a familiar path, one I had driven countless times over the years, so I pressed on. I couldn't help but wonder what was going on. The HOA, the Homeowners Association, had always been a strange entity to my father. They were the ones who governed the community, setting rules about everything from waste disposal to the upkeep of properties. My father had never been a fan of them. They were too corporate, too controlling. And now it seemed they had taken their control a step further. They'd tampered with his power supply. By the time I arrived, the storm had only worsened. The cabin stood in front of me, dark and silent, a stark contrast to the snow-covered world around it. As I parked and made my way to the porch, I saw my dad sitting there, his back against the doorframe, the cold air whipping around him. He was wearing his heavy coat, but there was something in his posture that told me he wasn't just cold. He was angry, deep down. The man who had always been calm and collected was clearly rattled. He looked up as I approached, his face set in grim lines. "Glad you're here. You need to see this for yourself." I nodded, knowing this wasn't just about the power anymore. Whatever was going on, it was bigger than a mere outage, and it was just the beginning. I followed my father inside, the warmth of the cabin wrapping around me like a comforting blanket. The fire in the hearth crackled, its orange glow casting dancing shadows on the walls. But there was no comfort in the space today. My dad's demeanor had shifted from frustration to something more complex, something I couldn't quite place yet. He gestured for me to sit down, his brow furrowed as he poured us both cups of strong coffee. I could tell he was trying to keep his cool, but the tension in his shoulders spoke volumes. "Tell me what's really going on," I said, settling into the worn leather chair by the fire. He sighed heavily, his eyes locking onto mine, as if deciding how much to reveal. "It's not just about the power, it's about control. The HOA. They've been pushing me for months, trying to get me to rejoin the grid, as they put it." I raised an eyebrow. "You're off the grid. Why would they care?" "They care because they've been trying to get a stranglehold on this whole region for years," he said, his voice low. "I've been managing my own energy system up here for over a decade, and it works. I'm not some naive fool who's going to let them dictate how I live." I leaned forward, trying to grasp what he was saying. "But why now? Why cut off the power when you've been operating like this for years?" My father paused, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "Because they know I'm not just any homeowner. I'm more than that. I'm the one keeping things running. Around here, unofficially, of course. This whole area, the homes, the cabins, even the small businesses, they're all connected to my system in some way. I'm the one who's been regulating the power flow without them even knowing it." I stared at him, trying to process the bombshell he'd just dropped. "Wait a second. You've been running the grid for this whole region?" He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Not in the way they think. I'm not some corporate executive with a bunch of spreadsheets. But yeah, I've been monitoring the energy here, making sure everyone's electricity stays on, making sure the flow is steady. There's a delicate balance to it all, and as long as I kept things running, they couldn't interfere. But now they want to take that control away from me." I couldn't help but feel a pang of admiration. My dad, this quiet, solitary man, had been the backbone of the entire region's power system without anyone knowing. He'd quietly held the community together, ensuring that the homes, the businesses, and everything else had the energy they needed to survive. He was the unseen force that kept the lights on. "So, what happens now?" I asked, my mind racing. "What are you going to do?" "I'm not just going to sit back and let them take what's mine," he said with a steely resolve. "I've been trying to reach out to the other homeowners in the area, but it's hard. They're all afraid of the HOA. They've got everyone under their thumb with fines, fees, and threats of power shutdowns. The people here are scared, but I'm not scared of them." The fire popped and crackled, but the warmth in the room did little to ease the chill settling over me. The HOA wasn't just some group of bureaucrats. They were a well-oiled machine with power, resources, and influence. If they could take my father down, what would stop them from taking down everyone else? The realization hit me hard. My father wasn't just a victim in this situation. He was standing on the front lines of a war for control of an entire region. "I'm going to find out who's behind this," he said, his voice calm but filled with determination. "And when I do, I'm going to make sure they understand exactly what happens when you mess with the wrong person." The gravity of his words settled over me like a heavy weight. My father wasn't just fighting for his cabin or his independence. He was fighting for the community he had silently protected for so long. And now, the fight was coming to his doorstep. But I wasn't about to let him face it alone. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, research, and planning. My father had always been the one who kept things running smoothly, quietly handling problems on his own. But now it was clear that the time for quiet solutions was over. The HOA wasn't going to stop until they had full control of the region, and if they succeeded, it wouldn't just mean the end of my father's way of life. It would mean the end of everything he'd worked for, everything that had kept this area independent and free from corporate hands. I sat down at the small desk by the window, my laptop glowing in the dim light. Outside, the storm raged, snow continuing to fall in thick sheets, but inside, the air felt heavy with tension. My dad had spent most of the day going through old files and paperwork, trying to find any evidence that would point us in the right direction. It wasn't easy. The HOA had made sure their operations were opaque, shrouded in layers of bureaucracy and legal jargon. But we were determined to break through it. Late that night, as I sifted through yet another set of records, I found something that sent a chill down my spine. It was a series of communications, encrypted but not as securely as they thought. I'd worked with tech systems long enough to know how to crack a few codes, and after several hours of painstaking work, I got in. The messages were between the HOA and a large energy corporation, a company that had been making quiet moves to buy up land and energy resources all over the state. What I found was even more unsettling than I'd imagined. The HOA wasn't just targeting my dad because he was off the grid. They were working with this corporation to consolidate control over the entire region's energy supply. The emails were filled with coded language, but the message was clear. They intended to replace all independent energy sources with one centralized system that they could control. And judging by the tone of the communications, my dad's power system, his careful, meticulously crafted network, was a major roadblock to their plans. I leaned back in my chair, digesting the weight of what I'd uncovered. They weren't just trying to run him out of town. They were trying to seize the very thing that had allowed this community to function without them. My dad had been the unseen regulator, the one keeping the power running for everyone around here. They knew that if they could get rid of him, they could monopolize the grid and charge whatever they wanted. No one could stand in their way. I snapped my laptop shut and went to find my father. He was sitting by the fire, his face grim, staring into the flames. When I told him what I'd found, he listened in silence, his expression growing more stoic with each word. "They've been planning this for a long time," he said quietly, once I was finished. "And they've been using every trick in the book to get me to give up. The fines, the harassment, it's all been a part of their plan. They want to break me down, make me give in." I could feel the anger rising in my chest. This wasn't just about power. It was about control, manipulation, and greed. These people wanted to own everything, to turn every community into a cog in their corporate machine. And my father had stood as a barrier to all of it. Now, they were coming for him, and for the entire region. But my dad wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. I knew they'd make a move sooner or later. It's just the way these things go. But what they don't realize is that I'm not alone in this. I've got people here who will back me up. It was then that I realized just how deep my dad's connections ran. He wasn't just a recluse. He had been building relationships over the years, quietly forging alliances with others in the community. People who relied on him for more than just power. They relied on his integrity, his willingness to help, and his refusal to bow to anyone. If we can rally enough support, we might be able to push back, I said, my mind working through the possibilities. But it won't be easy. These guys have a lot of power. We need to be smart about how we do this. He nodded, his gaze unwavering. We will be. But first, we need to show them that we're not afraid. I could see the fire in his eyes, the same resolve that had kept him going through everything. Life had thrown his way. We weren't just fighting for the cabin or the land. We were fighting for something bigger. We were fighting for the right to live on our terms, to stand up against a system that wanted to swallow everything in its path. The next morning, we began making our plans. My dad reached out to a few of the other homeowners while I worked on gathering as much information as I could. We both knew this wasn't going to be a quick fight. The HOA and the energy company had deep pockets, and they weren't going to back down easily. But neither were we. And that made all the difference. As the days passed, the sense of urgency grew. My father and I worked in tandem, each of us handling different parts of the operation. My father reached out to his network of contacts, friends, neighbors, and old acquaintances who had relied on him for years. Some of them had already been quietly affected by the HOA's tactics, unexplained outages, sudden hikes in fees, and the ever-present threat of fines. But many were still in the dark about the full scope of the HOA's plans. It was time to bring them into the fold. Meanwhile, I focused on digging deeper into the HOA's operations. I spent hours combing through the encrypted files I had uncovered, trying to piece together a clearer picture. What I found only solidified my fears. The Energy Corporation was not just interested in controlling the local grid. They were strategically purchasing up land, water rights, and other resources in the area, all with the intention of consolidating their hold on the region. The emails I had decrypted spoke of a coordinated effort to create a smart grid, one that would replace all independent power systems with their own centralized for-profit network. It wasn't just about power. It was about controlling everything, from the energy that flowed through the region to the very land people lived on. But there was a twist I hadn't seen coming. The HOA was playing both sides. While they were working in lockstep with the corporation, they were also positioning themselves as the middleman. They promised to protect homeowners, to provide better services, and to eliminate any issues. But in reality, they were setting everyone up to be dependent on the very system they were creating, an energy monopoly that would give them absolute control. As the storm outside raged on, so did the storm in my mind. I couldn't let this happen. My father had dedicated his life to keeping this community independent and free. It wasn't just about the energy, it was about the principle of self-reliance, about living without the overreach of corporate giants and bureaucratic entities who thought they could control every aspect of life. My father had been right all along. He wasn't just a quiet man running his own system. He had become the unofficial protector of the region. If the HOA succeeded in silencing him, they'd be free to take control of everything. It wasn't just the cabin that was at stake. It was every home, every business, every life that depended on the energy system my father had carefully built and maintained. The weight of it settled heavily on my chest. By the end of the week, we had gathered a small but determined group of homeowners willing to fight back. Most of them had been too intimidated to speak up before, but now, with the truth laid bare, they were ready to stand with us. It wasn't just about their electricity anymore. It was about reclaiming their autonomy, about fighting back against the system that had been tightening its grip around their necks. We met in the cabin's small living room, the fire crackling softly in the background as the group assembled. My father stood in the center, his weathered face resolute. This is more than just a battle for our homes. It's a fight for the future of this region. If we let them take over, if we let them dictate how we live, they'll never stop. The room was quiet, but there was a shift in the air. People who had once felt powerless now stood a little taller. They weren't just homeowners anymore. They were rebels, united against a common enemy. The spark of rebellion was in their eyes, and I could feel the weight of what we were about to do settling over us. We spent hours strategizing, mapping out our next moves. My dad had already laid the groundwork for a counterattack. He had backup, systems in place that no one, not even the HOA, could shut down easily. But it wasn't just about infrastructure anymore. It was about exposing the HOA's corruption, about letting the public know what they were really up to. We need to make a stand, my father said, his voice steady but with a fire beneath it. We need to make sure the people see what they've been trying to hide, and we need to show them that we won't back down. I knew that wasn't going to be easy. The HOA was powerful, with deep pockets and connections everywhere. But we had something they didn't: the truth. We had the power of knowledge, and we had the people who were ready to fight for it. In the quiet of the night, with the storm still howling outside, we made a pact. We weren't just defending a cabin, we were defending a way of life that refused to be controlled by outside forces. We were standing up for the right to live on our own terms, and we weren't going to let anyone take that away from us. The battle had just begun. The days following our meeting were filled with a sense of purpose, but also a creeping anxiety. Every decision we made felt weighty, each step bringing us closer to a confrontation that none of us could truly predict. My father, always the steady hand, became more focused, more determined with each passing hour. His usual calmness was now laced with a quiet fury that drove him to push harder, faster. He knew what was at stake, and his sense of urgency was contagious. The group of homeowners who had rallied behind us also took on a new energy. They began organizing in small teams, contacting others, spreading the word. The fear that had once held them back now transformed into resolve. We were no longer just fighting for my father's cabin. We were fighting for our homes, our independence, and our futures. The first major move came when we organized a community-wide meeting. The goal was simple: to expose the HOA's manipulation and their secret dealings with the energy corporation. We couldn't do it alone. We needed the public behind us, and the only way to gain that was through transparency. The meeting was set in the local town hall, a modest building that had always served as the heart of our small community. But as the day of the meeting drew nearer, it became clear that not everyone would be willing to stand with us. The HOA had been working, over time, using their influence to silence those who might speak out. Several people who had agreed to attend the meeting suddenly backed out, citing business or family issues. I suspected the HOA had made sure their voices were quieted. Nothing too overt, just the subtle pressure of being isolated from the rest. Still, the turnout was bigger than we expected. Dozens of people packed into the small room, their faces a mix of skepticism and curiosity. As my father took the floor, the room fell silent. He didn't stand up there to give a speech. He didn't need to. He just spoke plainly, in the same way he always had. He laid out the facts, explaining the situation, showing how the HOA had been working with the Energy Corporation to take over the region's power grid, and revealing the trail of corruption and manipulation that stretched back months, if not years. The evidence was undeniable. The reaction from the crowd was mixed at first. Some were shocked, others angry, and still others simply confused. But as my father continued, the room began to shift. People who had been on the fence started to question everything they had taken for granted. How had they let this happen? How had they been so blind to the creeping encroachment on their freedom? And more importantly, what were they going to do about it? Then, just as things seemed to be gaining momentum, a sharp knock echoed from the back of the room. The doors swung open, and in walked two representatives from the HOA, their presence unmistakable. They were well-dressed, their smiles too perfect, their air too polished. The crowd immediately tensed, sensing the power shift. One of them stepped forward, a man I recognized from previous HOA meetings, and addressed the room with a calculated calm. "We're here to make sure this meeting doesn't mislead anyone," he said, his voice smooth but carrying a hard edge. "The HOA has always acted in the best interest of the community. We've been working tirelessly to provide reliable services and improve the quality of life for everyone here." But the crowd wasn't having it. Whispers filled the room as people started questioning the man's words. One by one, people stood up, challenging the HOA's representatives. The power dynamic had shifted. This wasn't just a group of disgruntled homeowners anymore, it was a movement. The HOA representatives tried to regain control, but their polished rhetoric fell flat against the undeniable truth my father had presented. In the middle of the chaos, I looked over at my dad. His expression was one of quiet triumph, but there was something else in his eyes, a deep sense of knowing. This was the turning point. Whether the HOA liked it or not, the battle was no longer just about power, it was about the people. They couldn't keep pretending to serve the community if the community had seen the truth. But the victory was bittersweet. As the meeting ended and the crowd slowly filed out, a lingering feeling of uncertainty settled over us. The HOA wasn't going to take this defeat lightly. They'd retaliate, of that I was sure. But we had made our stand. The fight had gone public, and the momentum was now in our hands. Whatever came next, we would face it together. We would show them that we weren't just a group of isolated homeowners. We were a united front, standing against a system that sought to control everything in its path. And that, I realized, was something they could never take from us. The war was far from over, but it had only just begun.